patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 137 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me for this solo episode, first one of 2024. Before we get into our solo episode, first of all, a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. They are the most dedicated fans of this show, so I really appreciate all their support. You can go down to the Patreon link down in the show notes below if you would like to contribute to this podcast. Once again, this show really can't be possible with these kinds of supporters, so I just want to, once again, appreciate and express my gratitude to our loyal supporters. And also a thank you to our subscribers and our listeners. If this is your first time listening to Friends and Fellow Citizens, welcome. If you enjoyed this episode and check out our other interview episodes and solo episodes, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. You can also subscribe to our mailing list as well to get notifications right in your inbox for new episodes. Today's episode will be about another gentleman who I think just does not get enough recognition in political life and really just life in general. And I always try to find figures. So for those who have been with this program for these years, you will know that our focus is very much on the revolutionary/early American time period as well as the Civil War era. And it's because really these two eras have defined America in so many different ways. These are really the two turning points. Think of the Washington Monument as kind of the monument to representing the birth of America, the birth of the presidency and of the history of this country. And then you have the Lincoln Memorial in D.C., obviously not too far away from the Washington Monument. And when I was in D.C., I just really thought those two monuments really come together symbolically as well. And within these two eras of American history lies these very, very important figures who contributed so much to American history, but for many reasons don't get the credit they deserve. This episode will help to highlight one of these individuals. This week, we'll be talking about John P. Hale. Hale is a senator from the state of New Hampshire, and what I will do for this episode is highlight some of the different parts of his career, and then we will go into a speech that he did in 1862, and I'll speak a little bit more about the context of that speech, and we'll read some excerpts, and we'll discuss a bit about the significance of some of the elements of that speech. I think this will be a good way to not only do just a recap of a person, which anyone could really do, but to really get into some of the writing and really his speech. It would be a very different element and a different way of seeing this individual. And then in the end, I'll wrap up with some big takeaways that I think we can all get from this man. John Parker Hale was born in 1806. He was born in a town called Rochester in Strafford County, New Hampshire. He attended a very prestigious school named Phillips Exeter, which you may have heard of. When I was in middle school, there was one person in my class who ended up transferring, or after graduation, went to Phillips Exeter. So I know that it is quite a nice school there. Hale attended the Bowdoin College. He graduated from that school, which is located in Brunswick, Maine, and he decided to pursue the I guess you could say more traditional path of becoming a senator. So he decides to go into law, and he becomes a prominent attorney and starts rising in the ranks of the Democratic Party. He is a member of the State House of Representatives in 1832. Andrew Jackson, or I guess he and his administration noticed Hale as a prominent person in New Hampshire. So Hale was appointed as the U.S. Attorney in 1834. served for several years, and then as the Whig Party took over the presidency, then President John Tyler probably just saw the fact that Hale was a Democrat and was like, okay, well, you're out. So, that's how Hale eventually left that position. And Hale was very much in part of the Democratic Party machine and really just trying to get prominent Democrats elected. And so he was very much a supporter of the dark horse candidate, James Polk, and the Polk ticket, really. So the Polk George Dallas ticket, the Polk Dallas ticket in 1844. And James Polk wins the presidential election that year. At this point, you might be thinking, well, this sounds like a pretty typical story, and this guy, Hale, seems like a very typical good Democrat, I guess you could say, at least someone who checked the boxes to become a prominent politician at the time. Well, the story really changes in the 1840s for John P. Hale. Hale actually developed an anti-slavery sentiment. He was very, very much opposed to slavery, and you just kind of wonder how he was thinking all these years of being a Democrat. And this really is the reason why the story really changes and why Hale not only becomes a prominent political figure, but he no longer becomes a prominent political figure in his original party. Because of his views on certain issues like war, for example, he was very anti-imperialist. He saw through why the Democrats were advocating for the annexation of Texas. And it wasn't really on this idea of growing the Union because we all love a much bigger United States. He saw this as purely a means to acquire more political capital and, of course, grow the slavery in the United States. And so he starts becoming pretty vocal about the war, and he actually is one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, opponent of the Mexican-American War. This was a very, very big issue for him and his future in the Democratic Party, and it became such an issue that the Democrats, with then a future President Pierce, I should say. Franklin Pierce is actually a classmate of Hale, which is quite interesting. But Pierce and other Democrats in New Hampshire really put out an effort to kick out John P. Hale for his views. And I'll step back for a second and just acknowledge that a lot of times nowadays we see how members of both parties leave their respective parties. And what's fascinating is how people see that as a shock almost. It's like, wow, how could someone who's been a lifelong Republican or lifelong Democrat leave his or her respective party? And what we see with history is that this has happened many, many times, and it might just depend on the fact that there are notable people who leave the party. Obviously, a lot of ordinary voters can change parties, or they can just simply leave the two-party system. But this is a classic example of what happens when certain party members don't toe the party line. And as you will see later in this story, this really, I think, helped Hale's career a lot and helped make him the genuine statesman he would become. And so the Democratic Party really, again, makes this effort to kick him out. And that's actually what happened. He was basically, the convention came together and said, we're not going to renominate him for his congressional seat. Hale had become a member of Congress in the House, and he served from 1843 to 1845. Obviously, just that one term because of his views on slavery, speaking out against it. I'm not sure exactly how he expressed those views on an anti-slavery platform. I'm not sure if he just basically said, look, I see right through what you guys are doing, or if he just advocated based on the traditional arguments against slavery, about moral reasons and whatnot. But it didn't really matter, I guess. So he's kicked out, and he doesn't give up, though. He knows that there is a possibility that one could put together a good coalition on this platform of anti-slavery. And with that, Hale, because of his accomplishments, many people, I think, would argue, given his record, that he would be one of the first, if not the first, a major person in American politics at the time to run on an anti-slavery platform. This is very much evidence with his co-founding or co-establishment, I guess you could say, of the Free Soil Party, which is a third party, which I covered several solo episodes ago when I was speaking about Martin Van Buren, who was president and then later became part of the Free Soil Party. Well, the Free Soil Party ran on this platform of preventing the expansion of slavery. Again, it wasn't necessarily an anti-slavery platform. There were some who were, but I don't think that this party was even going to get anything done just because, well, it was a third party, and two, and it would really run into a lot of headwinds in the political environment at the time. The Free Soil Party, again, gains some traction, but with the help of some Democrats who were not so pleased with the party platform of advocating for slavery, especially growing the institution of slavery, Hale really starts developing these connections and this momentum. What some people have called the Hale Storm of 1845, which is very interesting. This is actually a debate between Pierce and Hale about, I would suspect, about the issue of slavery, as Pierce, even though he was from the North, he sympathized with the South. So I'm sure that debate was quite heated and probably would have generated quite a bit of coverage at the time, especially knowing that New Hampshire is a prominent state nowadays in presidential politics. You would kind of wonder how coverage would be like at the time. And because of Hale's efforts, they were the Free Soil Party and some of these other members of this anti-slavery coalition were able to defeat what seemed to be a very, very tough Democratic majority to win over. So it wasn't like a landslide sort of, okay, let's just take over the entire state, but at least it prevented a lot of these pro-slavery Democrats from implementing policies that not only would have aided the pro-slavery coalition, but probably would have maybe accelerated a little bit of that movement to implement slavery all across the United States. As we all know, the late 1840s, 1850s, as buildups to the Civil War, it just seems like, especially with the benefit of hindsight, every single political movement that was happening, every single action that was happening at the time was just part of that larger debate on where America was going to go. Hale really is, once again, a prominent figure when it comes to being able to really rally for a lot of causes. I mentioned that he was an anti-slavery advocate, but that wasn't the only issue he ran on as something that he just ran as parallel to his anti-imperialist platform. One thing that I found interesting was that he very much proposed two things that eventually became realities. One was the repeal of something called the gag rule. A gag rule basically is something that basically forces Congress to not discuss an issue. And boy, oh boy, there were a lot of people in the 1800s who did not want to talk about slavery. And Hale is like, oh, no, we're going to be talking about it. And he is one to really push forward the repeal of the gag rule, which was adopted in 1838. He successfully repeals it during his time in the House. In 1846, Hale was elected as an independent Democratic candidate to the Senate, and he served in that capacity from 1847 to 1853. During that time, he becomes a Free Soiler, which he helped to establish. And he probably was just very frustrated with the Democratic Party anyway, so it was probably not as much of a surprise as some people might think. Hale returns to the Senate, and he returns in 1855 because there was a gentleman named Charles Atherton, and what's interesting is that Atherton was the senator from New Hampshire as well, who implemented the gag rule. And so for Hale to replace him, I think is a bit of an irony here, knowing that so many people at the time in the Democratic Party wanted to go after Hale, and for him to prevail because of the efforts that he did to become a senator in the late 1840s and now coming back to the Senate really is a good testament to the kind of political coalition he was able to put together despite that party opposition against him. So he serves as a senator from the state of New Hampshire from 1855 to fill that vacancy. He was reelected in 1859, and so throughout for his term, he served as senator for that second run from 1855 to 1865, to the end of the Civil War. And now I'm going to read a bit of the speech that he does in the Senate in 1862. So just to give you some context here, first of all, we are right in the middle of the Civil War. So this already is a trying time for every single member of Congress. And it delivers a speech because the Senate is debating on a piece of legislation called the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act. The slightly longer version is an act for the release of certain persons held to service or labor in the District of Columbia. And this law would essentially end slavery in D.C., and it would provide loyal slave owners with an opportunity for them to petition for some compensation. So you can tell this was very much a deal that had to be hashed out between staunch abolitionists and members of Congress who wanted to keep the Union together, but who were not on board with abolishing slavery entirely, or even just any part of slavery. This eventually became law, actually of course, signed by President Lincoln, and it's actually celebrated in D.C. as Emancipation Day on April 16th. So very, very interesting how you have that kind of connection with a very notable piece of legislation in our nation's capital, still celebrated to some degree nowadays. And Hale is obviously speaking in favor of this legislation. He is responding to a senator named Garrett Davis, who is a senator from Kentucky. He is basically one to have Democrat positions on slavery, but he is one of those Democrats who was not in favor of secession. He wanted to keep the Union together, and Davis supported the Constitutional Union Party, which was the party that it's hard to kind of describe what this party was like. But basically, their position was we have to follow the Constitution. I'm thinking to myself, really, like that's how you gonna put together a party platform? Is we're just going to obey the Constitution? I mean, both sides, the slavery issue were honestly just saying that. They were saying we should abide by the Constitution by supporting slavery, or we should abide by the Constitution by opposing slavery. That's really what it was about. But the Constitutional Union Party wasn't successful anyway, so I'm not sure how Davis really fit into this whole debate, but nonetheless, that's just a little bit about Garrett Davis. So he is the senator from Kentucky, and basically Senator Davis makes the point opposing the legislation, and the senator argues that this would basically put too much burden on the District of Columbia. Basically, everything from just the management of the city to the economy, just things would fall apart. And Hale, of course, thinking to himself, like, boy, I am going to teach this guy a lesson. So he comes onto the Senate platform, on the Senate floor, and he delivers this speech here. And I'm going to read some excerpts for you just to kind of give you a glimpse. But I'll give you a bit of a synopsis of what Hale says, and then in certain parts I'll quote verbatim from that speech. So to start off, Hale is going to say that I am basically making this speech to go against this particular objection that the senator from Kentucky, Mr. Davis, made about this bill, and he acknowledges that we're not in this day and age. We are not making debates on moral principles. Now, it's not to say that he didn't believe in those, or that other senators were not debating the morality of this, but it's the fact that in this time period, a lot of members of Congress were debating the economic and political reasons for slavery. As much as we like to think that it was a moral issue, and it certainly was, and obviously it should be for so many reasons. However, at the time, it was very hard to build consensus, and Hale recognized this, and he wants to push back against what Senator Davis says. Hale describes how people like Davis really did not understand how they were putting together this argument. Davis is predicting that there was basically going to be some kind of mass chaos and things just falling apart. Hale says, no, if you actually look at history, and he uses a few examples, including Jamaica, as well as other islands, Antigua, Dominica, and St. Kitts, and some other examples, Barbados. And he uses these examples, and he cites specific statistics showing that emancipation of slaves grows the economy. And he basically just tells Davis, saying, look at the numbers yourself. Go to, he didn't say, go to the Library of Congress specifically, but he says, go to the government resources that are available out there and just look at the numbers yourselves. And we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the episode of some of these takeaways and how this relates to politics now. But I just really appreciate what he is saying. He's basically directing an action to another senator saying, if you don't believe me, just look at the data yourself. But that's not the most persuasive part. Hale, in this passage that I'm about to read to you, I think really sums up why he's such a persuasive person in this movement. And I'll read the quote to you here. Quote, Mr. President, there is nothing on earth that is more unjust, nothing more unkind. Of course, I do not attribute personal unkindness to the senator. I speak of a class, and I speak of it as a philosophical truth, that for this boasted white Caucasian race to enslave the colored race, to keep them in a state of ignorance, to keep them in a state where it is a penal offense to teach them to read so much out of the Bible as that they may learn that God made them, and Christ died to redeem them. I say it is cruel and unjust to such a people, denied the right of bringing a suit in court, denied the right of testifying as to their own personal rights and wrongs, the whole intelligence of the world shut out by the bar of an inexorable penal statute from enlightening their understandings, to pronounce them as degraded, ignorant, incapable of representation, because under the crushing weight of all these disabilities, they have not made such progress as to enable them to step at once on an equality into a condition which their masters have enjoyed for many years. It is cruel. The injustice of it cannot be winked out of sight. It is as unjust as it would be to put out the eyes of a man and then taunt him with his blindness, as unjust as it would be to reproach any man with a personal deformity. It is as unjust as it is possible for perverted human intellect to be. Take off these burdens. Give them a fair chance. Let the light of science shine into their minds. Make it no longer a crime punishable with imprisonment to open to them the pages of God's eternal truth. Let them read something of the world that is about them, and something of the hope which leads to the world beyond them. Give them the elevating influence of some of the motives that have elevated you. And then, if against all that they fail to rise and fail to improve, then, and not till then, will it be time to reproach them with their inability to cope and contend with their white masters. Unquote. And I'll stop there. This is such a powerful message that Hale delivers. What is most persuasive is not just the fact that he opposes the coalition and the views that Senator Davis and other pro-slavery advocates have. It's the fact that he provides a vision He said he provides a vision that emancipation will bring about opportunity, will bring about hope and change, positive change for these people. And that is what I think really makes this so persuasive. A lot of times we like to oppose things. We like to say something's bad. But what about the vision that we want to have? And I think Hale really articulates so well, especially about those points about religion. I mean, especially knowing that at that time, with religion is so central to people's lives and should still be today. The fact that he's saying that emancipation can allow these individuals to discover religious freedom, to discover a path to become better human beings. I mean, that really, really sinks in, I think, for all these people. And I can't begin to imagine what it was like to be able to sit in that chamber, to be able to hear something like this. Hale continues by saying that we have the ability to change this. We have the ability with this bill to be able to make a statement and to be able to allow these people to essentially pursue their dreams, to pursue their goals in life. He said, we have it now in our power to put this experiment to the test. He's acknowledging that we're not sure exactly what's going to happen. And to be honest with him, if we were around that time, we wouldn't know exactly what would happen either. But he says that we have this power to be able to make things happen, to make good things happen. And what is interesting is that he says we have it in our power to satisfy the senator from Kentucky and those who sympathize with him, whether his apprehensions are well or ill-founded. What is fascinating is that he's not going to go and say, hey, Senator Davis, you're such a bad person, all that. I mean, first of all, he might not even know whether or not Senator Davis has good intentions or bad intentions, but for the purposes of formality and for his speech, he recognizes that, hey, Senator Davis might want the same thing as I do, but that if we succeed in this experiment, this would actually satisfy, this would actually put out the worries that Senator Davis has. And Hale is going to basically wrap up here, and he first sums up by saying, look, Senator Davis is claiming that this is going to lead to crime, it's going to lead to degradation, it's going to lead to poverty. That's the dark, what he calls the dark picture, which fills his imagination. So that's one view that he sees. He's going to read to him, quote, "Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. Thou shalt cry, and he shall say, Here I am. If thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke, the putting forth of the finger, and speaking vanity. And if thou draw out thy soul to the hungry, and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shalt thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. And the Lord shall guide thee continually, and satisfy thy soul in drought, and make fat thy bones. And thou shalt be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. And they that shall be of thee shall build. Thou shalt rise up the foundations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in." Isaiah chapter 58. Hale concludes, quote, "Now, sir, this nation has an opportunity, if I may say so, and I say it reverently, of putting the Almighty to the test, and of seeing whether the consequences that his prophet has foretold, or his senator has predicted, will follow as a result of this measure." Unquote. And that's the end of his speech. What I appreciate, and I hope you appreciate as well, which is the vision that he proposes, quoting from a religious text, to show that that the United States has an opportunity. And again, this is with a legislation that only affects an area of about 10 square miles. Hale offers a better vision for the United States, an opportunity to fulfill goodness by passing this bill. And so I'll wrap up with just a few final facts about Hale. He eventually, once again, serves the remainder of that term after he's elected in 1859. He was appointed as the minister to Spain from 1865 to 1869. He wasn't very successful at that, though, but that's okay. He goes back to New Hampshire, and he passed away on November 19th, 1873, so right in the middle of Reconstruction. Fun fact about Hale, though, he actually had two daughters, and one of his daughters was named Lucy. Actually, his wife is named Lucy as well. Anyway, one of his daughters, Lucy, was actually engaged to John Wilkes Booth, which I will be honest with you, it was hard to believe when I read about that. I cannot believe that someone like her would do something like that. But love is complicated, and I'm not sure if Hale would have approved that anyway. I mean, who knows what Senator Hale would have done to John Wilkes Booth if he had his hands on him. But of course, Booth, as we all know, unfortunately shot dead the president, and Hale, Booth is shot by a man named Boston Corbett. And when they found the body of Booth, he in one of his pockets, he had a picture of Lucy Hale. So really, that's probably good evidence to show that Booth was very much attracted to Hale, and Lucy couldn't believe that Booth would do something like that. That's her view. I'll take her word for it, but just kind of a weird, fun fact there about Hale's family. But there you go. That's about John Hale, and I would like to leave with a few takeaways before we wrap up this episode. The first is that people back in those days also had trouble backing up their opinions based on facts and reasoning too. And I'm really speaking about Senator Davis. Now, one can go so many different routes on just where people have come with these different ideas. But as Hale was suggesting, Senator Davis basically was saying, well, all these bad things are going to happen, but he had made no reference whatsoever to history. And I would say that Senator Davis really didn't do his homework, and probably his aides were not the ones doing his homework either. I just bring this up as a takeaway because a lot of times it's understandable why we feel like we are in a bit of a post-truth environment. I think technology has been a big factor in that. With technology, as a human being, as a species, we can't catch up with our own technology in so many ways. We might feel that politics is not about truth anymore. We feel that people are always or almost always going to base their views on lies and on deceit. And it's understandable why we are there. And there's a lot of that for sure. I'm not denying that is occurring. But one has to also realize that this sort of problem was also occurring in different stages throughout history. There's never been a time when there was just all truth or even mostly truth being spoken by our political leaders or by just ordinary citizens. There were people at that time, some of the most educated people at the time couldn't even come up with concrete answers to their beliefs. You heard the views of Senator Davis, and you just think to yourself, really, that he's just going to go on this rant about how destructive it's going to be after emancipation, and Hale goes, and what's fascinating again is that he doesn't just go the traditional line of saying that you are bad, you are wrong, this and this and that. He says Senator Davis is wrong, but he also has the facts and the truth on his side. He backs up what he's saying, and that is something that we can always improve on. I'm not saying that we have to come up with the perfect statistic every single time we express an opinion. But at the very least, and this is something that Hale even mentions too, he acknowledges that he's not very familiar with certain things. Like he hasn't read, he even acknowledges somewhere that he hasn't even read the entirety of the Dred Scott decision, how it applies to one of his points that he was trying to make. But by acknowledging that you are on a mission to try and find out for yourself about what the reality is on the ground, what the facts are, and make possible sources to get those facts, I believe we go the extra mile for our cause, for our beliefs, when we are honest to ourselves. By being honest to ourselves, we can be honest to others. We can be more forthright on where we think political life should go, where policies should be implemented, or which policies should be implemented. But then there are times when we need to just realize that we have a lot more work to do. And that's just the point I want to make, was people struggled with putting facts and opinions together, which we should all do anyway, as a matter of principle. And that there were just times when those were a struggle. And so recognizing that, I think, puts some things into perspective for today. The second is, I encourage people to be politely passionate about your political views. And I invented this, politely passionate. I'm not sure how much that's going to get out there as the new way of saying that we can be civil and passionate about our beliefs. However, I do feel that this is the way forward, is when we are genuine but also nice about it. I think it could go a long way. I mean, imagine if Senator Hale just went off and just said a bunch of expletives. Would that even be something that people would look up to about Senator Hale? Of course not. They would just look at him and say, "Well, why is he so off the rails?" He's such a passionate guy, as you've seen with this history about this senator. He cares a lot about this issue, but he's not going to go overboard and make crazy claims. He's not going to. He even said, "It's like, I don't know if the senator it really means what he's saying, or if he has good intentions or bad intentions. He's attacking the argument." And this is the point that I want to make too, which is we can be very passionate about our views, but if we're not building relationships, if we're not building a sense of trust, we're not going to get anywhere, and we're not going to be able to promote the political beliefs we care about. And we've seen so many instances of, especially nowadays, when it comes to debates on major political issues, whether it was the war in Ukraine or the Israel-Hamas conflict. I mean, the tragic invasion, a tragic attack by Hamas on Israel. I mean, for so many years and decades, we thought, something like this could never happen. But then it's not even just about the issue; it's about how a lot of people nowadays are really going about the wrong ways of promoting their cause. Unfortunately, I think we are now at a time when people are not expressing their views against the government. They're using their views and they're punishing other citizens for it. And that is such a bad precedent to set. And that I think it's because of the actions that every single person takes, of how they express their passion, but also how they express their manners. I think these are the kinds of difference makers that are going to be that are going to be the deciding factors in how our society moves forward. And the final takeaway is we have to have a positive vision for what we are advocating for. I don't believe that we can ever run on a platform of, "I don't like this." Now, I didn't say that Hale was running on an anti-slavery platform, and that is true. But you heard that passage that he quoted from Isaiah, and you see how he's trying to connect this idea of having a positive vision, that we can unleash all this human potential if we pass this legislation. And while we might not be able to use that exact wording, when we pass a bill renaming a post office, right? But the point is that when we advocate, when we promote our views, have a positive vision, show why your policy is going to make these things better. Imagine what these things can do. This is what I think is so weird about protesters, is because they don't have a positive vision for anything. They just want to oppose something. And that's one of the reasons why I do think a lot of protests don't work, is because they don't give visions for people. They only present a very narrow view on opposition. But people don't live on opposition. They live on opportunity. They live on optimism. They live on, once again, a positive future, however that positive future is. So I encourage people to incorporate that imagery, incorporate that into advocating for good visions, for visions that uphold the values that we hold so dear. And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode about John Hale. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to check out the links down in the show notes below to learn more about the program or to be able to be a supporter and contributor for this podcast. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.